Brad, I saw somebody using an e-ink reader yesterday.
What's so unusual about that?
It was the size of a phone.
Oh.
So it was like the person was holding it like a phone, reading a book. And I walked up to them and asked them what it was because I'd never seen one before. And we talked about it and it looked fabulous.
Is it just an e-reader? It's not actually a phone?
So they make phones too, but the one he has is just an e-reader.
Wait, they do make phones with e-ink screens?
They're for people who have distraction problems.
Are they as slow to refresh as, for example, a Kindle?
It depends on how old. So they're faster than the old Kindles are, I would say now. Like if you have like an old first gen Paperwhite or something, probably faster than you're thinking e-ink, but they're still not. You're not going to watch a video on these.
Okay, I guess the better question to ask is like for people who've used Kindles, like that's quite slow when you turn a page. It's a good second as it kind of slowly refreshes the screen, and
it's faster than that, but it's like hundreds of milliseconds. It's not like
it's quite noticeable.
60 frames a second. Yeah.
Well, my question is that due to the slow processing of a Kindle? Or is that a feature? Is that a limitation of an e-ink screen?
Oh, it's because the e-ink screens are mechanical. So there's little balls inside them that float from the bottom to the top of a liquid.
There's locomotion in there.
Yeah, things are moving. They're very small things.
Okay.
But yeah.
Well, with that established, then, yeah, I guess you wouldn't be able to be distracted much by an e-ink phone because it would take forever to do anything.
Well, you say that, but like, I'm just as easy to I can distract myself just as effectively with a book as I can with, say, a video, probably more so. So
yeah, I guess you could scroll Twitter.
Yeah.
Are there color e-ink screens that are ubiquitous at this point?
You can get color e-ink, but you lose a lot of the benefits and they're still slow. And it's not like they're vibrant and look good.
I bet an e-ink phone lasts forever. Battery wise, I mean.
Yeah, I'm looking at some right now. There's the Boox Poke 5.
I'm sorry, the what?
The Boox Poke 5.
Boox?
Boox. I think that's how you say it. Boox.
Books?
Oh, so there's the Boox Palma.
Might just be books.
Well, why would they have two O's if it's just, why don't they spell it Books instead of Boox? It's not boo. It's not
something you can trademark.
I mean, but you think it's just books? I'm sad now.
Books.
I'm
going with
Boox Palma.
I suppose Boox is a bit more memorable.
Boox Palma might be the name of my Dragon's Dogma character. That's a good one right there. Okay. Sorry, not to. I didn't realize that the character that I made testing out Dragon's Dogma last night was going to be the character that I had forever because you can't delete and change your characters.
That's weird. You, me, and I think Vinny all have made characters in Dragon's Dogma initially that we did not intend to keep as our characters.
My guy, I always do that. That's like my MO for.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I usually start and play like just a little bit of these games to try the different classes. And I realize that there's multi-classing, but I also usually Monster Factory up the first one just on general principle. So now I'm going to go and tell you, my guy has an enormous body and a very, very, very small head and a very long neck. It's not, I have to look at it for a long, long time. And I'm like, I think they might get $2 out of me to add another character, which also feels kind of icky.
Wait, do they have that?
You can pay $2 and get another character.
That's not great.
It's not good.
That's not great.
It's a bad look.
I saw that you can also spend $3 for a fast travel crystal, which I believe is single use.
What?
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, I think it's part of the philosophy of this game that you should not fast travel. Like they want you to travel and run everywhere so you can like run into situations and find things.
I like that. I'm into that.
You can find those crystals in the game, but I think I read like one reviewer found 3 fast travel crystals their entire playthrough or something, or you could just spend money if you want to fast travel more.
Well, time matters in that game in a weird way, right? Like your quests can expire, your food goes out of date. Like
some things I think you can only do at night, etc. etc.
Yeah.
There's got to be save files you can just delete and start over.
They're stored on the server. I already looked it up.
Really?
Yep.
Huh.
I'm not super enthusiastic. I'm less enthusiastic than I was expecting. So this Boox Palma is $279.
Okay.
I'm kind of interested to explore. It's basically an Android tablet that's phone size and fits in your hand.
Do they list a battery life?
They do not, because I think a lot of times people don't put a number on that, because if you're a small company, that causes you some problems in the EU if your thing doesn't live up to it and people complain.
Oh man, this thing looks cool.
I'm sure it's going to annoy me.
Yeah, there's something really neat looking about this interface. I mean, it looks kind of like a smartphone phone home screen, but in e-ink.
Yeah.
There's something very like original Macintosh about it. It's, it's a GUI, but black and white.
Yeah, it has. Look, the whole thing has good vibes, I'm going to say.
You know what? I could use more good vibes in my consumer electronics.
Yeah. Welcome to Brad Will Made a Tech Pod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad. Hello.
Ahoy hoy.
That was high. I went for a slightly more theatrical presentation this week.
It was pretty good. It was high energy for morning. I was impressed. This week is GDC week.
Yeah. How was GDC?
It seems like things may be changing. Getting. I mean, it's part like developer rage fest and part everybody's like doing business again.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I don't know. I don't know how many people are doing business, but I did hear people say that they were doing business.
Wow.
So
I mean, it's been like not 6 weeks since DICE and things were very dire. A dire DICE.
It's definitely quieter than previous GD. Like, I don't know. GDC is always weird because there's like 3 GDCs, right? There's like the trade show floor where everybody's down trying to sell you middleware and crap. Mm-hmm. There's all the different tracks where you go to learn stuff, whether it's business stuff or developing stuff, or like there was a thing about new DirectX 12 API features. And like the whole brunt of that was, the GPU could do a bunch of stuff without the CPU now.
Like what?
Like access memory and like you don't need the CPU to set up a bunch of stuff now in DirectX 2.6 or something. I get the one that dropped like last week.
Are they ever going to rev the major DirectX number again?
I don't know that it makes sense to. Like I feel like maybe I don't know. Maybe next Xbox. And then there's also the Yerba Buena Gardens GDC, which is like all of like people just chilling in the like. People come up after they've been locked in the downstairs for a long time and they lay down on the grass or sit on the benches. Like there's a lot of business that happens around the fountains. And like, if you sit down there long enough, you just hear people talking about all sorts of secret shit. So it's
really?
Yeah. You bump into people. I saw a friend of the show, Danny Baranowski. I bumped into a bunch of friends. It was lovely walking around. So
could you surreptitiously hang out there with one of those directed long range listening devices? I'm not saying you should actually do this.
I'm going to go and tell you wouldn't have to do that. You just have to sit down on a bench and listen, because people will sit down 3 feet away from you and immediately start talking about super proprietary shit all day long.
Ooh.
Yeah. Anyway, this week we're not talking about GDC. We are going to talk about kind of home networking basics. We realized we hadn't really dug into this. We've talked about networking stuff. We've talked about like difference in Wi-Fi standards. We've talked about routers and modems and all the stuff individually. But we had a question in the Discord that was, "Hey, I just got a house and I don't know how to do the networking stuff, and I'd like to know. Like, I don't understand a lot of these terms, and I don't understand what the strategy should be." So
yeah, if anything, I would say this is one of probably the most asked question on the Discord. Like, just if I had to pick one thing that people show up saying like, "Hey, I could use some help with blank," it's majority of the time is some kind of home networking thing. So
this is a complicated topic in that there are a lot of choices to make, and there's not necessarily a right choice for everyone, right? Yeah. Like Brad's right choice and my right choice, and like your parents' right choice and somebody living on a farm's right choice are probably all different.
Yes. And I'll say there are more choices since, we may have covered this at least piecemeal in the past, but since we did that last, there are even more choices than there have ever been before, because like new categories and segments of the market keep emerging that are, like things that you used to only see in data centers are now available for $70 in the home type stuff. So there's more to cover than there has ever been before.
And it's also worth saying this isn't a product recommendation show, right? So we're not, we don't, by nature of our lives, we only test the stuff that we use. So
we're not in a position to try 12 different routers or anything.
Yeah, I mean, look, we could, but that's a different. we have to add a new patron tier for that, probably.
Become a very different show and lifestyle at that point.
Yeah, my wife will be pretty upset if I start bringing in a bazillion routers. So, with all that aside, let's start with some definitions.
Yes.
So there's a box that often your ISP will give you, but sometimes you can provide yourself.
Yes. Or in fact, in the early days, and by early, I mean like mid 2000s, everybody kind of had to provide for themselves, right? I think ISPs giving routers is a somewhat more recent phenomenon, like the classic Linksys WRT 54G, everybody bought one of those. Yeah.
So that's actually an interesting example because this has become a combo device. Like if you subscribe to Comcast or AT, like I have an AT&T fiber connection and I get a box from AT&T that has a router, a modem, a firewall, and a Wi-Fi access point all in it. And what those different things are is the modem, it takes the signal from the fiber network and basically talks to this other box on the wall that we'll talk about in a minute, called an ONT, that you don't have to worry about because your provider always gives you that if you need it, or sometimes you don't even need it. And then that modem converts that into just Ethernet. So there's like a one Ethernet port usually coming out of your modem, and like a cable line or fiber connection or something else comes into that modem.
I assume that's common to all cable connections. I haven't been on Comcast since 2016, and even then, I don't believe they were offering all-in-one. Like you still would rent a standalone modem from them and plug that into a router.
They've shifted to all-in-one. So now you get a box that gives you everything and includes when they talk about the 10 gigabit Xfinity network or whatever on their ads, they're talking about an all-in-one router, modem, Wi-Fi access point.
Is Comcast actually doing 10 gigabit these days? I find that hard to believe.
I think, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I think they're doing it because they're doing Wi-Fi 7. So they anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay, so along with that comes a firewall. So what that router does is it takes one IP address that your ISP gives you, and that's basically one point on the internet that everyone can access, right? And then they spread that out across all the devices that are inside your home network. So your TV, your consoles, your iPad, your phone, your watch, anything that connects to Wi-Fi, your light bulbs, if you have Wi-Fi light bulbs, all get internal private IP addresses that are assigned by that router. And the router knows which device gets which traffic based on this thing called network address translation. We don't need to get into.
Yeah. I think an easy way to think about it is that one major piece of functionality in a router is it's basically bridging two networks together. You're creating one network in your home between all your devices, and the entire internet is the other network.
Yeah.
And the entire public internet is being bridged to your little private network at home by the router. You'll also see the term gateway, that's basically what a gateway means. It's just a device that bridges two networks together.
Yeah,
more or less.
And typically at home, you have a private network and a public network. A gateway can do private to private or public to public as well as private to public. So, okay. So we have modems, we have routers, we have firewalls. The firewall is a thing that basically controls access across and says, hey, traffic can go out, but it can't come in for the most part unless it's requested. That's a basic security thing. You want to leave your firewall on your router, but this is generally just like in the old days, there might have been a box there that was a firewall. You can do that if you're in a corporate network. At home, it's probably just a piece of software that runs on your router.
Yeah. And generally out of the box, that's not something you're going to have to touch. And like, if you need to touch it, you probably already know why and what you need to do. If you have to open a gap in it for some device to get unfettered access to the internet, like you're probably going to know why you need to do that and how. But firewall, not really something you have to worry about.
Yeah, generally these days, even games, which were the kind of last firewall thing, are a little bit more forgiving.
Yeah, I always find it funny if you ever get down in the weeds with firewalls, though, and like look at how the rules are defined or like configuring one manually or whatever, like how simple it is. Not simple to set up, like the rules. Every time I've like tried to write firewall rules, it's very complicated. There's a lot of syntax depending on what kind of firewall. But I guess what I'm saying is like how fundamental or rudimentary it is for the thing to just say nah when a packet comes in from an outside source that is like potentially doing something nefarious or not. It could be totally benign, but like all it is dropping packets. All it is the firewall is like all the packets are running through the firewall, and if it comes from anywhere that it shouldn't, the firewall just says nah, and then it doesn't go through. You know what I mean? There's not some like advanced hardened technology going on there. It's literally just saying like, yeah, you can come in, no, you can't, and that's it. And there's nothing anybody can do about it.
And that's the beauty of the firewall is it's stupid, right? It just says, hey, don't accept any traffic on this port from anywhere. Access points. This is the next thing. The access point typically is also built into this router box. It's the thing that turns your network wireless. So where you can plug an Ethernet plug in on the back of your firewall and wire in. This just basically says, hey, I'm going to let you set up a name and settings and SSID, which is the name of the network, and WPA password, which is the kind of security thing you type in when you try to log out on your phone or your laptop or whatever. And yeah, that's it. It makes your network wireless. Generally speaking, the network will be strongest next to your router or your access point, and it'll be weakest the furthest away from your access point. So if you have one of these, you want to put it in the center of your house somewhere, ideally.
Yeah. I hope one of the things we'll demystify over the course of this episode is that the access point is technically like separate functionality, and in a lot of cases these days is a separate device now. Like,
can be.
I say that because a lot of people still just interchangeably use the word router for all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some cases, definitely not all, but in some cases it actually is beneficial to buy a separate access point and put it somewhere else than the router is. So hopefully that's something more people will realize, is that the router is technically separate and you can separate those if necessary.
Well, and the other benefit to having separate routers and access points, and again, this isn't for everyone, but the other benefit is it's like when you bought an old TV VCR combo, right? If the VCR and the TV VCR combo broke, then suddenly your TV was much less useful because you probably didn't have the right plugs to plug in another VCR on it.
Right.
It's the same situation with a router. If like once the super VCR came out, you couldn't upgrade to that as easily either. And Wi-Fi standards spin every 3 or 4 years generally. Yeah. So
also, if your VCR broke, you're without a TV while your TV is in the shop getting the VCR.
That is the exact example my dad gave me to convince me not to buy a TV VCR combo in 1993 when I went to college.
Yeah, I like piecemeal or modular everything. I think it's still usually helpful to separate stuff out as much as you can.
Yeah. So, okay. So we have that. There's a bunch of different Wi-Fi standards. They used to have confusing, like they weren't that confusing, but it was like numbers like 802.11b, 802.11g, 802.11n. A few years ago, they retconned that naming scheme to start with Wi-Fi 1 and go up to, I think we're on Wi-Fi 7 now, which is not quite out yet, but is getting close.
I think there might be some Wi-Fi 7 stuff on the market. I don't know if these are that much less confusing, because they also snuck Wi-Fi 6E in there after 6, and I was never clear what the difference was.
It's extreme, Brad.
Oh, of course.
The Wi-Fi standards, oftentimes you'll see hardware shipping before the standards are actually finalized. Mm-hmm. That means that the hardware spec is finished, but the software is still being locked down, and there'll be a software update that brings you to final spec. I find that to be a little riskier than I like to live on my network infrastructure.
Yeah.
But the basic gist is, if you have Wi-Fi 6 or newer, you're pretty good. The newer standards get better in higher congestion areas. So 6 and 6E are better than 5 for high congestion. Like and by high congestion, I don't mean, hey, you can see your neighbor on either side of your house's Wi-Fi access points. I mean, you live in an apartment in New York City or Chicago or San Francisco where the density is really high, and you open up the Wi-Fi finder on your laptop and there's 100 things there.
Mm-hmm.
So
sounds very familiar to me.
Yeah, I mean, you're living that life. Okay, a couple other things. Switches, network switches. Network switch, sometimes called a hub. Nobody really makes hubs anymore.
Yeah, I don't think you can you even buy a network hub at this point?
Yeah, I'm 100% sure you can buy a hub still, but you absolutely should not. You should always buy a switch.
Yes, switches are now very, very cheap.
Basically a switch lets you turn one Ethernet port into like up to 24, 48 Ethernet ports if you want.
Yeah. Or, a lot of the common ones, like the cheaper ones from TP-Link and Netgear, you'll see are like 4 ports or 8 ports. Like, I guess if you're really not super familiar with networking stuff, it's basically like an Ethernet switch box or switcher, or not switcher, or it's like a multiplexer. It's basically you plug one.
It's like a power strip for network.
Yeah, kind of. Basically, you're just adding a bunch of extra ports to an existing network, and then anything you plug in there is just immediately on that network.
People often ask if there's a downside to using those. There really isn't, unless you're in some kind of really high specific high traffic networking situations.
Yeah, you're not losing any real speed or latency. They've got special hardware in them that make them route stuff back and forth very quickly.
Yeah, the only place that there's a potential problem is if you're putting enough traffic on that one cable that goes to the next switch to kind of clog up the infrastructure there.
That is something to think about. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like the way I've got things run to the living room, like I have one long cable run down the hall, and now there's there's the Switch, PS5, Series X, like I don't even know what Roku, a bunch of stuff, and everything on the other end of that connection, everything on that switch down there is all limited to the speed of one cable going to it, right? Like everything has to share bandwidth between the 1 gigabit cable that's running to that switch.
But at the same time, the things that you have at the other end of that, like you're talking about consumer devices that are not going to saturate a gigabit connection for the most part. The consoles might now. For a long time, they wouldn't.
Yeah, when you download a game, you do get fairly close to that these days, but not enough to not enough that you can't also like stream YouTube or Netflix at the same time you're downloading a game.
The last one we have on the list to define is power over Ethernet. So this is a high-end, usually more commercial install setting, but it's coming to home stuff now, or to prosumer home stuff now, that basically lets you from a network switch, and use the network cable that's used for Ethernet is called Cat something. Usually, I think it goes up to 8 now. There's four cables in there that carry data, and then there's 4 wires that just do nothing generally. So you actually can run power over some of the extra cables. So you can run low voltage or low power devices like access points and switches and stuff like that over that.
Security cameras in some cases.
Yeah, security cameras, doorbells, whatever, all sorts of different kinds of things. And the upshot is, when you run, say, a access point to your ceiling or security camera to your ceiling someplace, you only have to run 1 cable. So you can put the power in at the switch end and then run everything else out over the Ethernet, and it'll just work when you plug it in, which is really nice.
Yeah. I don't know if you mentioned you have to get a switch that explicitly supports PoE.
You either need a switch that supports PoE, or you need what's called a PoE injector that lives on the switch side that you plug in. You plug a wall wart into the wall, and then you plug a short Ethernet run from the switch into this, and then the long one goes into the other end.
Yeah.
It's if you're looking, we'll talk about when this makes sense. There's really specific instances where it does, and most people aren't going to have to worry about it.
Yeah. One other quick thing to mention about switches before we move on. If you go to buy a switch, you might see what's called a managed switch.
Yes.
You probably don't need that unless you know you need that. A regular unmanaged switch is perfectly fine for most home applications. If you just need, hey, I need 8 more ports in this room. A regular $20, $30 TP-Link or Netgear switch off of Amazon is perfectly fine. Managed switches have a lot more capabilities that, again, if you need those already.
I put managed switches in. Often, if you're going to do PoE stuff out of the switch, you're going to end up with managed switches, it turns out. Yeah. The managed switches are nice because you can see what stuff is connected to each port individually. Right. Yes. You can turn things off and on. You can you have an app or a web interface or something like that to configure and control them, which is convenient, it turns out.
Yes, but they are quite a bit more expensive.
They are a lot more expensive, especially at the high port counts. So starting with wired. If you've bought a house and you can knock holes in the walls and you can do things like access the crawl space or the attic or whatever safely, then you can pretty easily run Ethernet. Like Ethernet's not particularly hard to run. A big spool of Cat 6 or Cat 7 will cost $150, $200. And if you buy you need a saw to cut holes in your drywall. I wouldn't advise doing this if you have plaster and lathe, if you live in a really, really old house, because it's much harder to fix and make look right. Get somebody who knows what they're doing to do that. Don't figure that out because plaster is really a pain to fix. Cutting a hole in the wall, and then you can get a drill on a big 6-foot long bendy shaft, and aim it down and shoot that drill down into the crawl space. And then ideally you have 2 people working on this. So then the person in the crawl space gets in there and ties a string up to the bottom of the drill, because there's always a hole in the bottom of these fishing drill bits. And you pull the string back up, and then you just tie your cable up to the string, and you can run cable all through your house pretty easily. It's like it took me about 6 hours to run Ethernet to every room in my house.
Wow, so that's not bad.
Small 1-story, with crawl space access, like not a big crawl, not like it's a belly crawling crawl space, but I still was able to get it done. The hardest thing was actually drilling through the concrete foundation, which involved some rebar, and I burned out a concrete bit doing that. But I have a hole into the garage, so that's all that mattered.
Yes. Would you say like cutting into the, I mean, I've never owned a home, maybe someday. Like just the general, like the basic cutting into a wall and installing a wall plate. Is that something that you would say kind of anybody can do that has next to no experience with like construction or home modification?
Well, so it's pretty easy. Yeah. Like there's a bunch of different kinds of mounts that you can use to hook those wall plates into. You can get cheap little, they're basically like a plastic ring. It's a rectangular ring that goes into the wall and makes a wall plate sized hole. And then it has flaps that when you twist the screws in it, it pulls it up against the backside of the drywall. If you can find the studs easily, which is a little fraught because sometimes the studs have power running next to them and you want to kind of be aware of that. But if you can find the studs easily, you cut your holes there, and you can even nail diagonally into the studs. So you have a really nice secure thing. Basically what you want is a gang box on the back so that there's something for your stuff to fall into.
Okay. I guess the distinction I was wondering about is if this is something you might need a professional for, or if you could just watch a YouTube video and make a quick trip to Home Depot and be good to go.
I mean, I don't think you should buy your stuff at Home Depot because it's pretty expensive there generally. Although I say that it's a lot better now than it used to be. You pay a little bit of a premium now. It used to pay paid to 2.5 times premium at Home Depot for network stuff.
Yeah, well, name your basic or your favorite source of basic home construction goods or whatever. But you know what I mean. Like if it's something you can just get the stuff yourself and do with a little bit of research online.
I think if the house is simple, it's relatively easy. If you have easy crawl space access, you have easy attic access. If you don't need to take out big chunks of the wall to do a run to home run everything, then absolutely you should be able to do this yourself. Obviously, look at your local code. Everywhere is a little bit different. Some places require different things. Some places require conduit. Some places don't. Conduit makes it a little bit more difficult. But yeah, so the basic gist is you drop into your crawl space, you lift into your attic, for a wired network, you want what's called a star topology. So everything starts at a home run, a center place where your router and main switch and all of your other stuff are. And then you branch out to the other rooms from there. So everything comes back to this one place. But then you can also add switches. So for example, there's a switch in my entertainment center, and that is where the consoles and the Apple TV and all of the stuff in there are plugged in. I have a big switch in the garage, and then I have a smaller one in the hall closet, just because that's where basically it was easier for me to run a couple of cables out to the garage, which is where the router and the fiber modem and the ONT and all that stuff are. But then actually run everything out of that central closet because that was way more central, and it meant I didn't have to crawl back and forth across the house on my belly 50 times to get the cables there. The last thing is, once you have the cables up, you do need to secure them. You don't want to leave them just flapping. And you don't want to be aggressive about stapling because Cat5 or Ethernet cable is a little delicate. So you want to do you can buy what are cable clips that are basically 2 nail clamps that don't apply any pressure to the cable, but will hold it and keep it from falling from being slack. You can use zip ties on nails and just not cinch the zip ties down super tight. There's a bunch of different options, but know that if you actually crimp or do real hard bends or right angle bends or stuff like that on the Cat5, you can impact your performance, which you don't want. And then the last thing is you're going to have to choose whether you want to crimp plugs on the ends of the cables or you want to put the ends of the cables into jacks and mount them in the wall. If you've gone through the trouble of drilling holes, it's better to put the jacks on the walls. It's super easy to do. You can Leviton, a bunch of different companies sell them. You can buy these at Home Depot. They're a little bit more expensive there than if you get them at an electronic supply place. But the ability to go out and get new wall plates and stuff is probably worth buying at Home Depot versus getting the cheaper deal. And the neat thing is they're coated. So when you're doing the stamping basically when you open up the back of one of these jacks, there's going to be 8 slots that have little cable grabbers on them, and you have a little push down tool you can get a cheap plastic one that comes with every one of the jacks. You can also buy one for like $40 that will apply the right pressure and stamp it in place and chonk the ends off and make it nice and tidy. It's called a punch down tool. And as long as you do this, there's 2 color schemes that are appropriate, that are allowed in Ethernet, in the Ethernet world, A and B. Just make sure you do the same one on all of them. And the jacks are color coded. So it'll be like, okay, the orange cable goes in the first slot, the orange white goes in the second slot, the green goes in the third slot, the blue goes in the fourth slot, the blue white goes in the fifth slot, the green white goes in the sixth, seventh slot, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, if you Google like Ethernet Keystone Jack, you'll see pictures of exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's the nice thing about doing this is if you mess up and like grab something that's plugged in and yank the end of the cable off, which can happen, especially on home crimped plugs, cable ends. It's not a huge pain in the, like, you just replace your patch cable instead of having to like redo this long run that every time it gets shorter, your stuff has to be a little bit closer to the wall. So I always recommend doing plugs and like buying patch cables, because it's while you can get good at crimping cables, it's much harder to do than doing the punch downs on the plugs, on the sockets. And then, okay, so 2 other things. People talk about plenum a lot. Plenum is a special kind of cable that doesn't burn as fast. So if you're in a fire situation.
Oh, yes, I've heard. Yes.
Yeah, like the internet grognards like to complain about people not putting plenum in. The rules, generally speaking, are that you have to put plenum any place that there's return air flow. So like in office buildings where there's negative pressure and like a drop ceiling, so that sucks all the return air in for the HVAC system, you have to run plenum. A lot of commercial installations just use plenum everywhere because it's easier to keep track of. It's more expensive, but it's not that much more expensive, and it's easier to keep track of. Easier to just run plenum everywhere than to keep track of what gets plenum and what doesn't. Most places don't require plenum for home. If my understanding is that in the types of fires you're likely to see in a home, plenum isn't going to make a difference one way or the other, but your mileage may vary. And like I said, it's not much more expensive. It's not more difficult to run. There's nothing about it that makes it harder. It's just the casing is made of different materials, so it doesn't burn quite as quickly and doesn't release toxic smoke.
I was going to ask what the end goal was there. If it was release of unpleasant substances was the main one.
I believe it's about the smoke, but I'm not an expert in that space. All I know is that when I looked at it, it was like $10 more, $20 more for the plenum spool of, I guess, 5E when I was doing my house. I just put the plenum in.
Yeah.
The other thing is about the number, which cat number to buy. 5 was really, really popular for a long, long time. When I did my house, 6 was just getting to the point that it was a viable price for like a home install. But I did 5E. It's been fine. We've been on gigabit Ethernet for 20 years now almost, and
although that's changing,
fine.
That's changing pretty rapidly. I believe regular Cat 5 will go up to 2.5 gigabit Ethernet if it's a short enough run. I don't have the exact run limitation in front of me right now.
I should test that because I have about a 40-foot Cat 5e run in my house.
So 5e, I believe 5e will go up to 10 gigabits. I think it's regular 5. Regular 5 will go up to 2.5, which even that is fairly respectable. But also, if you're buying now, I mean, Cat 6 is dirt cheap. Like, that's the default thing you should get.
Yeah, I think the Cat... What was the Cat 8 story? Is that a real thing?
I'm not sure about 7 and 8. Every time I've ever heard Cat 7 or 8 referred to, people treat it like it's not a real thing, or it's like a mythical non-standard. I don't know.
I kind of feel like if you're going to... My feeling, and this is more of a vibe than anything based on actual data, is that if you're looking at better than Cat 6, you probably should just run fiber for those runs that you care about.
Yeah, so we should talk about types of cables here. Cat 6 will do 10 gigabits up to 165 feet, which...
That's pretty good.
I'm trying to think what an average house looks like. That probably should cover just about all.
I could wrap that around my house all the way. Yeah.
So if if you think 10 gigabit, and 10 gigabits quite a bit, like if you think you're going to be good with that from now on, then Cat 6 is perfectly fine. I'm trying to think what is in megabytes per second. 10 gig is like, it's roughly a gigabyte a second. I mean, the math doesn't quite work that way, but that's a good ballpark way to think about it.
It's whatever 10 divided by 8 is.
Yeah. So it's but there's also network overhead to think about, so it's not quite exact, but
so it's going to be a gigabyte per second. Yeah,
roughly. But yes, there's also fiber now, which is getting much cheaper and way more reasonable. I started to say practical, but my understanding about running fiber is it's quite delicate. And you might actually need help doing that correctly.
So I was at Central Computer the other day, and they have pre-terminated fiber and the cables up to like 30 meters, I think, that were like $50. It was pretty cheap.
Yeah, it's pretty cheap. There are, I wish I can throw out a bunch of fiber terms. I can't define them well. Like, I think you want multi-mode fiber. There's like OM3 and OM4 are the standards you need to look at for what you'd be putting in a home, I believe.
Is that for bidirectionality or something?
I think it might pertain to distance or something. I forget exactly what the difference is there.
Well, the other thing is there's different terminators, right? So there's like that long rectangular one that's on most switches, it seems like, and then there's some other stuff that I don't know about.
Yeah,
it seems like to me, if you were into fiber, consider like the other thing is when they have the terminators on the end, it's gonna be hard to run them through small holes. Run the fiber through small holes, which is what you need.
You can get keystone jacks for fiber now. You can just get straight up wall plates that you can run one end of the fiber into the back of the plate and do a little patch fiber out the other end, which I assume those are fairly reliable.
Once it's the patches are fine, I'm sure.
Yeah. I feel like there's a couple more terms we should throw out just because you might come across them.
Okay.
RJ45 is the actual, like the specification or the descriptor for the physical, like what you think of as an Ethernet cable.
For the plug in the socket. It's like for the connector. Yeah.
Like the connector, the port that you see on your motherboard or the back of the PlayStation or whatever. That's RJ45.
Yeah.
I meant to look this up and I didn't quite get a proper sense. I think Ethernet is more a standard. Ethernet is not a physical port. Because Ethernet can also run over other types of ports. It's not just that particular plug that you see everywhere. Yeah. That's RJ45, just in case you hear that said. That's describing that exact plug. And twisted pair, I think, is also just kind of a generic term that you might see for Ethernet cable, for CAT, whatever.
Well, the twisted pair, inside the Ethernet cable, each of there's 4 pairs of wires, and each pair is twisted at a different amount per foot. So it minimizes interference across them, or they cancel each other out. There's some electrical engineering nonsense in there that I don't really understand.
You don't have to worry about that. The point is, though, sometimes just colloquially, especially like old network nerds will refer to Cat 5 or Cat 6 as twisted pair.
It is worth mentioning, if you untwist the pairs inside an Ethernet cable, they don't work right.
Yeah, I believe that.
Yeah.
The other, just because we'll address it later, because this stuff is getting dramatically cheaper, is SFP is the other big form factor plug you're seeing in home networking these days.
What is this?
It's the boxier looking plug. You've probably seen it on some stuff. I'm trying to think how to explain it. It stands for small form factor pluggable, and that's exactly what it is. It's a bigger port that accepts what is called a transceiver that gives you the actual port you're plugging the cable into.
Oh, this is for fiber.
Well, not just fiber. So you can have an SFP port that you plug an RJ45 transceiver into, and then plug any old Ethernet cable into that.
Oh,
that's why it's pluggable and modular. It's a port that you can turn into any other network port, essentially.
Oh, that's cool.
Which requires you, and that's what I use here between my NAS and my PC. That requires you to buy a transceiver on each end of each cable you're going to run. So that does get a little more expensive, but it gives you huge flexibility, and it also goes up to way higher speeds, which is where we're actually going with this. But it gives you tons of flexibility. Like right now, I'm running a direct attached copper cable between my PC and NAS. But if I say moved into a house and I want to put the NAS in the basement, I can keep the same network cards with SFP plus. In this case, it's QSFP plus. SFP does up to 1 gigabit. SFP plus does up to 10 gigabits. QSFP plus does 40. And it actually goes way higher than that. Fiber can easily go up to like 100 gigabits per second. Like, it's kind of insane. But the point I'm making is I can keep these same network cards I have and just pull this direct attached copper cable out and buy fiber transceivers and just plug those into these same ports. And then I can run fiber over a much longer distance through the house, through the walls, like up from the basement to an office or something like that. And again, all these SFP ports are something that were only in data centers until like 5-6 years ago. But if you keep up with the like kind of hardcore enthusiast like home lab scene, you're starting to see like very cheap switches mostly coming out of places like Shenzhen, that are coming with both RJ45 and SFP Plus on them. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but this stuff is being democratized and like made available for the home in a way that it wasn't even like 3-4 years ago.
I was going to say, yeah, it's the stuff is getting, it's much less expensive. The thing I'll say is, I don't think, unless you specifically need faster than gigabit, you have a faster than gigabit connection coming into your house, which is still pretty rare, at least in the US. I think you're fine running Cat 6.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like
Cat 6, like we said, will go up to 10 gigabits. And even that is pretty good. Even if you have some like central file store, like a NAS that you need to access things quickly on, like roughly a gigabyte a second is still pretty good for that.
It's hard to build a NAS for your house that's going to saturate more than a gigabit connection.
Yeah.
At least until SSDs get a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
So
and I think the stuff's gotten better for a while. 10 gigabit over RJ45 was like kind of problematic. Like there were heat issues. Like it used a ton of electricity, but I'm guessing that stuff has gotten better because you're starting to see it on like just motherboards now, like the high end, like workstation and creator motherboards are starting to ship with 10 gigabit RJ45 ports. So I think it's catching on in a way that it has not for several years.
And a lot of boards are shipping with just 2.5 gig, like high end boards are shipping with 2.5 gigabit ports as standard now too.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay. So I feel like that's kind of the state of Wired.
Yeah.
A couple other wild cards here is that if you live in a position where you can't run Ethernet in your house, or if you like the thing that you do is run it around the trim of your house, like you run a long run around like trim and wall trim and stuff like that in your apartment in a way that's non-destructive. Yeah,
that's because there's a absurd amount of Wi-Fi interference in here. B, like for my job, it is good to have wired consoles that can download games very quickly and like get the best online play and stuff.
Yeah. But there's also Powerline and Mocha. So Powerline and Mocha use existing cables that are in a lot of houses. Mocha is for cable, for like cable TV cables. Powerline obviously runs across the power wires. They're varying levels of performance. There's a bunch of wild cards about how they work. Both go up to a gigabit theoretically. In practice, that number varies wildly. And for example, if you have ground fault circuits in your house, or you don't have control wires everywhere in your house, or neutral wires everywhere in your house, then your power line network stuff is going to be less effective. If you have a lot of splitters and that potentially filter out frequencies that the Mocha adapters are using, your performance there will be dramatically reduced. So you might have to dig around in walls or crawl spaces or attics or garages or wherever and do some rewiring for your cable network if you're not getting Mocha speeds that you would expect. But it's a pretty good alternative if you don't want to do for stuff you don't want to do on wireless, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, just one data point. This is not universal. Like you said, everybody's setup is subject to a bunch of different variables. But just this very morning on the Discord, Wildfire popped into the network channel and posted some benchmarks. I guess they had been using Powerline previously. They were getting about 130 megabits up and down through their Powerline adapters. They just switched to Mocha over the coax, and that is now 800 down and 670 up. So
that's pretty good.
Yeah, my general impression is that Mocha is better if you have the option.
Assuming you don't have cables from like the 80s, yeah. If you have relatively modern coax cables, yeah. There are security issues with both of those because they do tend to leak out of your house, especially if you live really close to other people. Mm-hmm. So pay attention to that when you're setting it up. And any of that stuff I would buy from someplace you can return it. Generally speaking, if you're concerned about latency, which is the amount of time it takes stuff to traverse the network, not the speed at which it goes, Mocha and Powerline are both better than Wi-Fi and worse than regular traditional wired Ethernet. So it is nice if you play games and care about stuff like that, then that matters. So that's wired. Wireless is there's multiple options to add wireless to your network. You could take the box that your ISP provides, and it's probably going to be okay. They almost certainly charge you per month for it. Although actually that's not true. Your cable provider almost certainly charges you per month for it. your fiber provider may or may not charge you per month. Like I have AT&T fiber. They provide a box that I have to use. They don't charge me for it because I have to use it. So that I think that's nice.
Yeah, when Sonic gave me a router ages ago, and I actually had to like call their support when I sent it back to them and had to get them to knock the whatever a month off.
Oh, really? They were charging you?
It was not much.
Okay.
Yes.
So when you're talking about adding wireless to your network, there's a few different ways to do it. There's using the thing that your ISP provides. There's using a single box that's like the thing your ISP provides, but is the Wi-Fi, the router, and the firewall and everything all in one box. This is
the classic Linksys.
Yeah, the Linksys
up to today.
Yeah, if you look at the thing at Best Buy that has from ASUS that has 35 antennas on the outside, that's what we're talking about.
Yes, the Crown of Sauron.
Yeah, the people in the Discord like TP-Link Archers a lot.
That's been the recommendation for years now, from everything from like Small Net Builder to Wirecutter to you name it. Like kind of always the baseline that I see is the $85 TP-Link Archer.
My last non ISP provided router was a TP-Link router, and it was great. It was really nice.
Yeah.
It was like 10 years ago at this point.
Yeah. You can spend dramatically more. I mean, like this category of router easily goes up to like $300-$400 now.
Yeah. So I think if you're buying entry level, this is a good place to be. I think if you're going to spend more money, there's probably better options for you is where I end up.
Yeah. Cause this is going to limit you to a single like kind of radio point, like all your Wi-Fi is going to emanate from this one box, and depending on your layout of your house or interference or like the thickness of walls,
where the refrigerator is,
right? Like that may not be ideal for signal strength everywhere you need it.
Think about your Wi-Fi router as creating a donut of good internet around it. And the further you get from the center of the donut, from the hole, the worse your internet's going to be.
Yes, I think we can all agree that several donuts is better than one donut.
I like having multiple donuts. Okay, so the one router is one option. Mesh networks are a relatively new addition. They've been good for a good 5 years at this point, but they are basically little boxes that you typically buy a 3-pack of them. You plug one into your router, and then the other two you put around the house in different places. You can wire them in if you have Ethernet running in your house. So like, for example, at my parents' house, they ran Ethernet along in their basement on the exposed ceiling, and then just tacked up mesh nodes in the different areas of the house where they wanted better internet. That worked great.
So if you're wiring I've never used a mesh. And I've kind of been curious, just like in a signal sense, like what they're doing. Like if you're wiring every mesh node, they're not talking to each other wirelessly as well, right?
No, they do not.
Okay.
I mean, you want them to be close enough so that you get a gentle handoff. You don't want there to be a dead zone between them, ideally.
Right.
But yeah, no, they basically like, and the neat thing about this is, say if you live on a farm and you have a barn that you want to have internet in, and you have Ethernet running to it, you only need 2 mesh nodes to cover your house. You can put the third one in the barn. You just have the same Wi-Fi in your barn when you get there, which is it turns out pretty nice.
Right. The reason I ask about that distinction is because not everybody is going to be able to or want to run an Ethernet cable to every little mesh thing that they've got around. So I'm curious what's going on in a Wi-Fi radio sense once you have a bunch of mesh nodes up that are all just wireless.
So the reason these mesh nodes got good 5 years ago is that radios got cheap, and they went in the old days, a Wi-Fi to Wi-Fi repeater would time slice the radio. So it would say, okay, we have every 500 milliseconds, we're going to send on this channel, and then we're going to switch to receive for 500 milliseconds, and it would increase the latency dramatically, and it would slow the throughput across each repeater that you used. So they were bad. Old Wi-Fi repeaters are bad. Mesh networks have multiple radios in them, so each node will maintain a dedicated link to at least one other node that's wireless, and then have another radio for connecting devices that are connected to that particular node. Now, that only works if you can get the mesh nodes close enough to each other that they have good signal strength, which is important. There's tools that come with all of these mesh nodes that help you figure out, like they'll say, hey, mesh router 3 is not in a good spot. You need to move it and find a better spot for it. And because all they need to connect is power, you basically can just pick it up and move it to another power plug, or even like rotate it 90 degrees on the shelf that it's on, or move it someplace else, see if it gets a better signal. And the software most of those come with software that will help you work through that.
That's cool.
They're fine. So like all Wi-Fi stuff, the latency isn't the best it can be for games. But like I play competitive multiplayer games with people that are on mesh Wi-Fi networks and it's fine.
Yeah, it is doable, although I find it funny. Do they still do this in shooters? They definitely do in the fighting game space. They generally will expose what kind of connection each player is on as you matchmake with them.
So they don't expose it, but like Fortnite says, hey, your network connection will be better if you're on wired than Wi-Fi.
Okay. There's definitely a bit of a stigma in some multiplayer communities when you're able to see if your opponent is on Wi-Fi or not.
Well, so the other thing about meshes is you don't necessarily like there's an Ethernet port on each of these mesh nodes. And if you're on a Wi-Fi connected node and you plug a switch into that Ethernet port, then everything downstream of it's going to think it's on wired.
Yeah.
Even though it's on a Wi-Fi mesh that's kind of permanently connected. So it's a little bit of a weird situation. It's I quite like mesh networks for people who are non-technical, especially.
It seems like the middle ground between just the one single router access point box and the like going nuts on hardcore network stuff, which we're about to get into. But like the you want better and bigger Wi-Fi coverage, but without having to like do a bunch of network topology and routing stuff yourself.
Yeah, if you don't want to have to think about it too hard and you don't do big file transfers or aren't a competitive game player, yeah, there's nothing wrong with mesh. I think, and by nothing wrong with mesh, I mean, hey, mesh is good enough for like 95% of the market, right? A massive percentage of the market.
Yeah, it seems very commonly used, just anecdotally looking at people talking about stuff. And there's also a ton of brands doing pretty solid mesh stuff from what I can tell.
Yeah, Amazon does Eero stuff. TP-Link has a whole sub brand that's mesh nodes.
Netgear Orbi, I see talked about a lot.
Yeah, and the nice thing about them is that they come with apps so that you don't have to understand how to go to 192.168.0.1 to set the whole thing up. You just kind of plug it into your network, and then the app says, "Hey, connect to this AP," and then you connect to this AP, and you go through the whole setup process. And it's designed for people who don't need to and don't know how networking stuff works, which is good.
Yeah, ASUS, Google Nest. I'm just looking at lists. There are a lot of options for meshes.
So yeah, the ones that I see recommended most often are the TP-Link, the Google Nest, and the Netgear Orbis. Amazon bought my favorite company, and I wouldn't recommend that you give Amazon access to your DNS information and your network usage.
Yeah, it's a personal choice.
That's Eero for the record. Okay, so the last one is to separate out all of these into separate boxes, which seems like it's more expensive at first, right up until the point that you get a new Wi-Fi standard. You're like, shoot, I want to upgrade my Wi-Fi. And then instead of replacing 3 boxes, you replace 1,
yes,
right, or 2.
Yes. It's basically a slightly higher initial outlay of cash.
Maybe.
Well, not even that much. Like maybe an extra $100 or $2, but then down the line, it's going to save you.
Yeah. So in this case, you would, the upshot, the nice thing about this is you don't have to replace the router all the time, right? So you replace the thing that requires the least configuration when you update to a new Wi-Fi spec, and you leave the router in place for years on end in some cases.
Yeah.
Often the access points will be things that you can mount high up on a wall or in the ceiling or whatever. They often are power over Ethernet instead of a thing that you plug into the wall. To the point that I think Ubiquity doesn't even ship power bricks with theirs. I think you have to buy the power brick separately if you're not going to use power over Ethernet.
The Unify I got, I mean, this was 6 years ago, came with a PoE injector. I don't know if they still pack them in or not.
I think that's an option when you buy the kit. You choose whether you want the PoE injector one, or if you don't. In the interest of reducing e-waste, if you have PoE switches, then they just give you the option to buy it without the injector.
Okay. For people who aren't familiar with this category, if you've worked in a big office, you might have seen these stuck to the ceiling of your office. They're basically big white, either like discs or pucks, like rectangular.
Yeah, often there's a blue light.
They'll often say Cisco or Juniper or Aruba on them or something. Until recently, those were like corporate level, like big area access points to serve like big office type settings. But they have started trickling, like a lot of this stuff, they've started trickling into the home.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, for me, it was about price. Like I was always interested in them, but they used to be very expensive. And the last 5-6 years, they've gone from being a 3 times multiplier on price compared to like a commercial consumer access point to being cheaper in some cases. Like when I bought my 6E stuff, Wi-Fi 6E stuff, it was $120 per access point, which was cheaper than buying 2 mesh nodes to put in my house.
Yes.
So.
And again, to reiterate, I mean, like in my case, for example, my access point is not only is Wi-Fi 5 AC.
AC is 5. Yeah,
I think that was the point where they made the branding change. So I've got a Wi-Fi 5 access point in here, and not even like a high end one. It was kind of one of the mid range or lower end UniFis at the time. I could just get rid of that thing and get a Wi-Fi 7 access point next year or in a few months.
Yeah.
And not even touch my router, which is nice for all kinds of reasons. A, you don't have to replace it from a monetary standpoint. B, you don't have to reconfigure a new device just because you wanted new Wi-Fi, right? Like,
yeah, the reconfiguring, not having to reconfigure the router is, it turns out, an important part of this whole thing for me. Yeah. The other nice thing about buying the separate access points is you can buy versions of the access point that have antenna infrastructure tuned for your use case. So, for example, you don't need these at home, but they sell ones that are designed for like conference centers that are designed to have hundreds or thousands of people connected to them at a time. They do sell, and this may be interesting for home especially if you live someplace rural, antennas that are designed for high coverage areas and low congestion areas. So like you can put an access point up on the side of your house that will give you coverage over, 3 acres or 8 acres of your farm or something.
Yeah. Some of them are designated as like long range access points.
They will sell you weatherproof ones so you can put up outside if that's a thing that's of interest to you.
Cool.
And yeah, so like basically you have more flexibility when you're setting up your network to tune it for how you use your stuff.
Yes.
You can even buy, we talked about this on a Q&A episode a few months ago, but you can even buy point-to-point antennas that will let you put a wireless downlink between like a house and a barn or something like that if you want to have like cameras set up for your folding shed or whatever.
Yeah. You can also, I don't think we mentioned this, you can also mount multiple access points in a way that gives you somewhat of a mesh-like setup, except that they all have to be on wired internet or wired network. Like you have to run network cables to all of them. They can't. You
can get mesh ones now, but yeah.
But it's kind of like the same concept where your device would hopefully just gracefully hand off from one access point to the next as you move around. But that's device dependent, right?
So assuming you have, assuming you set up the same SSID and passwords and the same basic configuration stuff, like which version of WPA you use, how many channels you're binding, like whether you're doing dual channel or single channel, stuff like that, it should just gracefully hand off. And that's what I do in my house. It works flawlessly with everything all the way back to like a 3DS.
Yeah, I think that it does come down to the device's internal logic for like detecting signal strength and deciding which one it should be connected to, I believe. Another thing to note here is that generally you can't administrate these access points on the access point. You usually have to run some kind of software externally to provision them, which is basically like sending settings to them and telling them what to do. Usually, like in the case of Ubiquiti's UniFi stuff, you can just run that software on your PC if you want.
Yeah, so I actually have the software running on my NAS, I think, in a Docker container or something. But yeah, it is a little more involved setting up and running. But you can do things like, for example, I have all the lights in my office, which are sitting right next to an access point, locked in the software to only be able to connect to this access point. The other access point in the garage will reject them, which is nice.
Yeah. Another thing to note, the reason I bring up that central controller software that you have to run is, for example, if you bought like 3 access points that you want to deploy around a larger house, like you said, they all need to be on the same SSID, same security and password stuff. Generally, that central software will let you just deploy those settings to all those access points with like one click, basically. Like say, hey, I want all of these to be configured the same way, and it'll just do that.
And that is one of I have multiple Wi-Fi configurations. I have one for like guests, like when we have a babysitter or something, and then I have one that's for everybody else to use. And you can deploy them, like you said. You can just say, hey, put this on all the access points.
Yeah. The last piece of good news I'll throw out there, if you're interested in this separate access point setup, is you don't even need to buy a new router to do this. If you have a router, even if it's like one of those TP-Links or something low end that you're happy with.
I'm using the one that came with my AT&T fiber connection.
Right. Like all you have to do is disable the Wi-Fi on your integrated router and buy an access point and plug it into your router and you're good, basically. I mean, you still have to set up the access point, of course, but like you can just turn off, and you should turn off the Wi-Fi. You don't want clashing Wi-Fi networks with your old router, but like the point is, like, a Wi-Fi router can still just be a wired router without Wi-Fi if you just want to turn that off and buy a newer access point. You don't need to go get some fancy, Soho or prosumer router to run one of these things.
No, and it's often overkill for home users. So yeah, and then so that's that. The last thing is that routers are more open now than they have been kind of ever before.
Yes.
There's multiple competing operating systems out there for router.
A lot of stuff you can do. Real quick, I'm just going to rattle off as we move on into rolling your own router. Some of the big brands and access points, if you're just curious, like Ubiquiti's Unify is quite popular. The TP-Link Omada stuff seems to be pretty well liked on our Discord. It looks like when you search for access point now, like Netgear has some, Linksys has some. It seems like companies are rapidly getting into that space and rolling their own out. So there's a lot of options.
If you have a house that was built in the last 20 years, it probably has Ethernet in the walls. And then that puts you firmly in, maybe I should just plug an access point in instead of using these mesh networks. The benefit of the access point over the mesh network is that the access points are generally way cheaper. The mesh networks are $300 to $500 for a 3-pack. Depending on which version of Wi-Fi you get. The access points will be $100 each for the latest hot shit Wi-Fi. So yeah,
and you may not need more than one access point depending on the size of your house. So yeah, you can also just kind of roll your own router now, and it's getting easier than it's ever been. We did an episode ages ago with a friend of the show, Wes Finlan. Remember, he came on and talked about PFSense.
Yeah, that was the first time I heard about PFSense. I think probably.
But so. At the time, he was running that on, if you remember, like his old PC, like a full-size box. And that's not great from a power consumption standpoint, obviously, for something you're going to leave running 24/7. Hardware has never, stop me if you've heard this one before. Hardware has never gotten smaller and cheaper and more power efficient and faster than it is right now. Like, we're in like this kind of golden age of tiny little x86 boxes with a bunch of network ports on them for cheap that are very fast and actually don't use that much power at all.
Yeah.
There are Celeron and Pentium options that have been out there for ages, but the Alder Lake N100 boxes in particular in the last year or two are super popular and incredibly fast. You can get a quad core N100, and to be clear, the cores on these things, they're single core, they're not hyper-threaded, but a quad core that is faster than like a 6700K, for example. Like the cores on these things are faster than the big CPU desktop CPUs of 8 years ago or whatever. Like, they're very fast, and they use like 30 watts max, like 20 watts, something like that.
Well, and most of the commercial routers you buy are using ARM or even MIPS chips. So it's not like routing is, until you get above a gigabit, routing isn't like a massively CPU dependent kind of task.
Not hugely, no.
Yeah.
But these are pretty cheap. Like, you can get unconfigured ones like $150 or something. You might have to add like RAM and storage, and these little boxes, a lot of them are fanless. Most of them have like 2.5 gig RJ45 ports on them. Some of them are also starting to ship with SFP plus ports. So you can do 10 gig and fiber and that sort of thing on them. There's a lot of options out there. You can go to Serve the Home if you want to read more stuff about this. ServeTheHome.com is a good place to look at reviews of a lot of this like commodity but high-end network hardware that's been hitting at like a very rapid pace. And network switches are also starting to show up with, you'll see a lot of combo switches now that are like a bunch of 2.5 gig ports and like 2 to 4 SFP plus ports as well for like $100 or less.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, like, if you don't mind buying from AliExpress, you can buy a N100 based built for PFSense computer with 4 2.5 gigabit LAN ports on it for like $130.
Yeah, it's crazy. You can get slightly like more reputable or like brand names you've heard of boxes domestically if you prefer. But yeah, a lot of people just get stuff off of AliExpress these days. And crucially, like we said in that episode with Wes, you're installing your own OS on it. You're not dependent on some software that is shipped from a vendor that you need to worry about being updated regularly or secure or whatever. Probably pfSense or Open. I would lean toward OpenSense these days, which is a fork of pfSense that I think is a little more modern, and also the people who run it are cooler. Some of the pfSense people we've talked about in the past have not been great.
There's
in the
scene drama.
Community. A lot of scene drama there. But both of those give you a web GUI, just like you would get on any traditional router. So even if you don't have a lot of network experience or even like experience messing with little embedded devices like this, you can get instructions quite easily to install pfSense or OpenSense on this box. And once you've got that up and running, like I said, it's got a web GUI just like your integrated consumer router would, and it, you log into that and walk through the setup steps in the same way that you would anything else. So
when you do that, there's a responsibility towards security that you don't have necessarily with like your ISP provided router.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say anything connected to the open internet should be updated regularly. Let's say.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is it's up to you as a user to pay attention to security updates and to patch frequently and fast. Because often like an exploit will land and you'll have 2 weeks before something starts infecting your router, which once you've infected your router, it's bad news for everything on your network. You don't want that.
True. I mean, I think out of the box, these are probably more secure than what you would get from a vendor that is not that aggressive about patching stuff.
Oh, no doubt.
But yeah, you would want to keep an eye on updates for these.
It's not I'm just saying it's not a thing you want to set up, put in your closet, and then never look at the UI again. You need to either set it to automatically update when updates land, or stay on top of it. In for example, if you don't update your Home Assistant install for 2 years, probably not that big a deal. If you don't update your OpenSense install for 2 years, you're being a bad citizen of the internet.
But again, I'd say that for every router. Like you should update your router. Just the thing that protects you from any nefarious activity out there on the internet, you should absolutely make sure you update on a regular basis.
Agreed.
There's also, I'll throw it out there, there's also VyOS for people who really want to get nuts, which is command line only.
What is VyOS? Oh, no, thank you.
VyOS. It's Linux based. The other two are FreeBSD based. So like VyOS has some more robust capabilities, let's say, but it does not have a web GUI. So if you really want to get nuts with networking, it will do more, but you have to configure it all from a command line.
Yeah, that sounds like it's for people who really like pain and suffering.
Reporting for duty.
Yeah. Okay, I know where you're going with this. Maybe I'll do a pfSense or an OpenSense one later this year.
To be clear, this is where I intend to go. I'm still on a Ubiquiti Edge router, which they have basically unceremoniously dropped support for. So at some point, I'm going to have to get off that thing because it's basically unmaintained now. And this is absolutely what I'm doing from now on, is rolling my own and running one of these OSs, because these things get updated constantly. Well,
I'll send you a link to this AliExpress thing. You can put that on. I'm sure it's probably fine.
Yeah.
It'll be fun. It'll be an adventure. Yeah. But I guess that's as good a place as any to wrap it up for us this week.
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks to this was a fun chat. If people have questions, please send them in. We're doing a question episode next week, so it's a good time for it. The email address is techpod@content.town. It's techpod@content.town. And this is also the part of the show where I remind everybody that we are a 100% listener supported show. So we wouldn't be here without the generosity of our listeners and patrons. So thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you.
If you would like to find out how to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/techpod. Again, that's patreon.com/techpod, where for $5 a month, you get access to the Discord, where you can get in and watch people asking questions in the networking channel all the time. You can talk about your Gunpla stuff. You can post a bunch of food pictures. You can share pictures of your cats and dogs and desks and other pets. Or you can just hang out and have a nice time and make some friends who have similar interests to you. You also get access to the Patreon exclusive episode, which will go up next week sometime, or maybe the week after, because it's only the 22nd as I'm looking at the calendar now. There's one day the week after, so it'll probably be next week or the week after, where we talk about kind of projects that we're working on, things that are front of mind, but maybe not worth a full episode. And as always, a very special thank you goes out to our executive producer tier patrons, including Paddle Creek Games, makers of Fractured Veil, Andrew Slosky, Jordan Lippett, Bunny Jerk.
Whoa.
I know, I feel like something happened there. Just Wedge, Joel Krauska, Twinkle Twinkie, David Allen, James Kamek, and Pantheon, makers of the HS3 high-speed 3D printer. Thank you also so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And I guess that'll do it for us this week. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Tech Pod. It's question time, so get those questions in. We will answer them. We will turn the Q's into A's when we see you next week. Bye, everybody.